All right, see folks joining. Folks will start in about 1 minute or so. Let people start to join. Hope everyone has their morning beverages, coffee or water or tea, whatever you have. I have mine right here. It's a venti caramel crunch frappuccino. Okay, folks, good morning. My name is Gary Clark, President and CEO of Economic Alliance in Snohomish County, coming to you with another Coffee Chats conversation. And I'm really excited about today's conversation. It's going to be a very rich one, and we have some very established individuals to join us today. But before we dive into that, as always, we have a little bit of housekeeping information. And first things first, we'd like to thank Leadership Snohomish County, LSC, for helping connect us with two of our panelists joining us today. They are alum of the LSC program. LSC builds a community of authentic leaders providing programs that center equity, foster leadership skills for life. So if you haven't checked them out, what are you waiting for? Sign up, join them. Also, housekeeping items. We want to make sure that you put your organizational name in your chat so that we know who you're with when you comment. And also, by saying comment, we mean engage. We need to have a robust conversation, honest conversation, and that only happens when our viewers and participants are engaged. So please, please feel free to engage. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our panelists. First and foremost, Philip Jacobs is the new Executive Director of Washington Employers for Racial Equity. In his former role as a consultant, he was the lead on a program called Racially Savvy Leadership, which equipped executives to have impactful conversations about race in the workplace. Philip, thanks for joining us. Also, what you all may not know about Philip is that he is actually a music producer, and his acquired taste is actually hip hop, which I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about that maybe. Next on our list of panelists, we have the very awesome Tony Neighbors. Tony is actually the first person in the history of Washington State to hold the title of Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Public Housing Authority. He is also the founder and principal consultant of Tony Neighbors Consulting, a DEI firm committed to supporting organizational, systemic, and personal change. So if you have not engaged Tony Neighbors and his consulting firm, make sure you check him out. Tony, welcome. And what I'd like to say about Tony that I learned is that he is definitely into photography. So keep that in mind. And last, but definitely not least, we have Nishika Stanbro, who stepped into the position of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager for Community Transit in March. She previously served as a crisis communications, public information officer, and media relations specialist at Community Transit. She has been involved in workplace equity initiatives and previous positions at Washington State University, Everett, and the Everett Clinic. Stanbro is a board member of the Community Foundation of Snohomish County and the Everett High School Blue and Gold Foundation, and serves on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the Public Relations Society of America, Puget Sound Chapter, and the Everett Clinic Implicit Bias Task Force. And Nishika also is an avid roller skater and rock climber. So welcome everyone. Good morning to those folks joining us. I'd like everyone, if you have a chance, in solidarity, let's raise our coffee cups, drinks, or whatever you may have in front of you. All right. Now, we are going to have an open conversation here, but first things first, I'd like to allow each of our panelists to just say a brief good morning and welcome. We'll start with Nishika, and then we'll go to Philip and Tony.
Yeah, I just want to say good morning. My name is Nishika Stambro. Super happy to be here. My pronouns are she, her, and Aya, and my racialized identity is Black. I'm a multiracial woman, and my cultural identity is Caribbean and Jewish. So nice to see everyone here.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. Thank you, Gary and Economic Alliance. Just looking forward to having this conversation. It's really important that we continue to double down on it. So just glad to be here and to see all of you. Thanks.
And good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Tony Neighbors, Tony Neighbors Consulting. Also very glad to be here. My pronouns are he, him. I have been engaged in this work for, I think, quite literally my entire adult life. And so I'm very encouraged to be able to see so many different leaders in the professional community in the area just stepping up to learn and to engage. And so this is an honor to be here with you all today. And I'm really hoping that these conversations can be impactful for all the ripple effects that can go forward after this.
Well, thank you all. I'm excited to start this conversation. So first things first, we want this to be very open. So again, as you have questions, comments, please put them in the chat. I'll do my best to follow those and give those questions to our panelists. But first, let's ask a question about providing some terms that attendees may have heard, but may not be sure what it is. And so some of those words and phrases, we hope that we can get some form of a definition from each of you, or whatever you feel comfortable with providing. These words are intersectionality, microaggressions, and unconscious bias. So whoever wants to jump in first, feel free.
I can at least get the conversation started. I'll start with intersectionality, just to take one. So intersectionality, it's coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a genius Black woman leader when it comes to DEI that I recommend everybody follow. But it's this idea that all these different identity characteristics, so you're talking race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomics, so on and so on and so on. And pretty much all of these identities in society, there are spaces where people have more access and more privilege and more thriving, and social systems just tend to work in their favor. And then groups of people who are the exact opposite, where social systems are really not designed to work in their favor. So for example, racially, social systems are designed to work in favor of white people and to be at the detriment or not paying attention to Black and brown people. For sexuality, it's heterosexual as opposed to people who are LGBTQ, and all these different types of ways you can break it down. Intersectionality says that none of these identity categories exist in a vacuum. None of them are silos. As a matter of fact, they're overlapping, and they tend to make issues of privilege versus issues of marginalization even more complex. So for myself as a Black man, and let's say this is true. I'm passionate about issues that have to do with racial equality and racial equity. And so I could, grab a platform and speak about racism and the ways that we need to unravel and fight against racism. But if I'm not aware of the ways that this gets even more complex for Black women, and then also maybe Black women with disabilities who also are LGBTQ, like if I'm not aware of the ways that those intersecting identities interact with one another, then there's a really good chance that I'm going to either at best ignore people, and then at worst actually cause harm to even groups of people that I'm hoping to speak on behalf of and to advocate for and to empower. And so intersectionality says that all these things matter, all these identities matter, and that any analysis or initiative or game plan that's seeking justice has to take into account the complexity of the human condition and the complexity of these systems. Does that make sense, folks?
Sounds good to me. I appreciate that. That was excellent. Does anyone else want to take a stab at a few of the others as well in your own thoughts or perspective? Microaggressions was another, as well as unconscious bias.
I'll take microaggressions, but I also want to add to what Tony was saying. I think he nailed it. And I would just kind of pontificate on how this shows up and where to look for that. One place is surveys, or anytime you're using measurable data. I think that's when you want to kind of ask yourself, am I looking for the intersectionality? You know, if we're working on a survey and we're looking at a group of people who are living so far below the poverty line, and then we're also focused on people who would fall into the limited English proficiency category, or Black and African American people, where are those intersections? So when we're pulling that data, are we looking for those intersections? Are we asking questions so that we can really pull that information? So I think it's really important to think about how it shows up in measurable data. As far as microaggressions, those are really statements, actions, or incidents that can be indirect, they can be subtle, and often are unintentional forms of discrimination. So they can show up as racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, and I've definitely experienced that myself. I think one of the common ones that shows up is as a child, I would compete in poetry contests, and I was often told by white educators that I was very articulate. And I thought to myself, of course I am. And also, why aren't my counterparts being told that they are articulate? So, you know, that's something that I didn't have the vocabulary or language to put my finger on it and say, that's a microaggression. But now, looking back, I know that that was. Another example is, you know, if someone were to say to a person who is transgender that they don't look transgender, that might have been meant to be a compliment, but that is really, it could land as if someone was unattractive, who is trans, or less than. So it's really having to kind of take a moment and pause and think about how the things that we say that we may think are okay, check those things, because they may be a microaggression. And I think it's important that if you are someone who has said something like that in the past, you know, learn from that. Don't kind of sit in a corner and feel like, you know, you have to be ostracized. Learn from that, grow from that.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. Philip, it sounds like your panelist friends here have left you with unconscious bias to stab into. So you can add any other context to what they've said as well.
Absolutely. I just want to plus one, plus two, what my esteemed panelists said. I totally agree, and thank you for breaking it down like that. My take on unconscious bias is it's also known as implicit bias. And it's what happens when we act on our subconscious, deeply ingrained biases, stereotypes, and attitudes formed from opinions that we have, from our experiences and our upbringing. Oftentimes, you know, this, I guess one of the best examples in which this can occur is during hiring processes, where, you know, folks that might have a name that traditionally sounds not white, you know, a Black sounding name, you know, or Asian sounding name, that well-intended folks sometimes might not think that those folks are as qualified as somebody who has a white sounding name. And oftentimes this might be done unconsciously. I also want to add to that, though, we all, just as human beings, have unconscious bias. Like, you know, it's just part of the human condition. And that's just something for us to be aware of. And to be thoughtful about what we may not be thinking about. And I think that's one of the important roles that diversity plays, is that you have many voices in the room, many different opinions to call out, point out things that you may not see. So I'll stop there.
That's excellent. You all given us a lot of insight there. I want to ask a deeper question though, and this is probably what most of the folks who are on this chat are thinking about is, well, how do I approach dealing with discussions on these topics of race, gender, equity? Any advice or thoughts on how to approach these topics? And so, Nashika, we'll start with you, and then we'll start with Philip after that, and then Tony, if you want to clean up.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of do your homework. So there is really a wealth of resources out there. So get out there, get on Google, and really start looking up these terms and looking for reading lists and things like that. I don't necessarily think that you have to depend on other individuals. You can do the work. And beyond that, I think it's really important for people who have done the work to hold, and this, I get this from Bernardo Ruiz and Tammy Farber. They taught us through the Leadership Snohomish County Racial Equity Cohort, but they talked a lot about holding this gracious space, this courageous space. And I think that that really is important for those who have done the work to hold this space for others who are new to the work. Everybody is coming in at different places, and just courageous, meaning that people can really be brave and be open to digging in and working through some of the tough stuff. And that that graciousness kicks in when, you know, people are allowed to make mistakes and really fail forward and learn from them. So.
Yeah, definitely agree with Nashika around doing your own homework on the topic of race and racism. Don't rely on others to teach you. But when they do educate you, I would say listen to them with curiosity and humility, because we can all learn from each other. Another thing I would add to that is, before you have a difficult conversation such as that of race, I would ensure that you have a trusting relationship prior to that. I wouldn't use race as the entry point to create a connection. You want to make sure that there is some trust that has been built, so that as you engage in that topic, that person will know your intention. And even if, and I think that also creates space for mistakes to be made if that happens. The last part I'll say is be authentic. Be authentic about what you don't know, and even your fears about talking about race. And as an added step to that, I'd encourage you to find out why you're fearful about having the conversation in the first place, and sort through that on your own or with people that you trust, and that will give you honest feedback about that.
Yeah, you're going to be hearing a lot of us at the end saying, yes, my colleagues definitely have it nailed. And I really appreciate hearing what each of you have said, and fully affirm and agree with those notions. I think just one thing I would add is to take some steps to introduce yourself to just even some notions, some of the ways in which human psychology intersects with how we receive and engage these conversations. So in almost every workshop that I deliver, even before I get to the content, I introduce this idea of the backfire effect. Has anybody in the room ever heard of the backfire effect? Okay, so I just learned about this maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Essentially, and this is a product of neurotypical human psychology. But when we receive information that is maybe more trivial, it's not a big deal. You know, someone comes from out of state, you tell them Olympia is the capital of Washington. They didn't know that, now they know, no big deal. But when we receive information that runs contrary to our core primary worldviews, those things that actually shape how we understand the world around us, our minds actually, and this is again, neurotypical human function, our minds treat that challenge to our core worldviews literally in the same category that it would treat a wild animal attack. that level of intensity, that level of just sort of, kind of big triggering sort of thing that happens. And what's wild about that is that even when that challenge to our core worldviews is supported by evidence and statistics and data, what it does by default is it causes us to get even more defensive and to dig in our heels even further. And so it's really important for us. I think especially for people in the room who are more in a learning space. And I'll call a thing what it is. When we're talking about race, I would say this comes up a lot more for my white friends because of the ways in which race and racism in these systems are explicitly created to benefit white folks. But oftentimes this backfire effect happens for us, but we don't know that it's happening. And then it totally short circuits our ability to engage with the conversation and listen and hear. And even, there might be spaces where, ooh, I was complicit in this thing, or maybe I participated in this thing, or maybe I didn't say anything when I needed to. But when we learn about the backfire effect and that it exists, we then actually have the beautiful ability to disrupt it. And so then we can self-regulate. We can actually pay attention to, ooh, how am I feeling right now? Have I received information that is factually incorrect, or am I maybe being challenged in a way that is just deeply uncomfortable to my mind, to my brain? So I think that's one thing that is really a powerful tool when we recognize that that is a thing, because then we can give ourselves tools to manage that. We can, do deep breathing exercises. We can, stretch our body and just be aware of how that anxiety and how those responses flow through our body, so we can more effectively show up as advocates and allies and ultimately participants in unraveling these systems that cause so much oppression and havoc in our society.
Love it, love it. So I'm gonna do an audible here simply because there are comments coming into the chat. I'll sandwich this together, and then you all can kind of dive in as you wish. One of the leading questions after the previous one was to talk about, well, what if I do something wrong or say something wrong? I have that fear of even engaging because I might make a mistake. We want to know if you all have advice for us on that piece. And then I want to sandwich that with the comments that are coming in. Specifically, how do you engage someone who thinks that this is a waste of time, who thinks that it does more harm than good to have this conversation? How would you artfully suggest engaging those folks? So feel free to dive in as you wish.
I'll try to dive in so I don't lose my train of thought on this. I think when you make a mistake around having conversations around race or equity, any of those, I think it's important to try to get an understanding of what injury you caused. So if it was just a misstatement that you made, or you spoke out of you put your foot in your mouth, something like that, then I think an apology can suffice. But if it's something where you totally missed the mark in terms of like impacting somebody's life, their livelihood, by unconscious bias, or just kind of going with the status quo, then you have to do your part to try to rectify that. So I think it just depends on the type of injury that was caused. What was the second question, Gary?
Yeah, so that second component was, what do you say, or how do you engage folks who might say that this isn't important work, or it's a waste of time, or it does more harm than good?
Yeah, so I tend to, personally, I tend to, it's not to say that I disengage from those folks, but I try to plant my seeds in good soil, or what I feel is good soil that's going to produce something. And so, I mean, you can show data, you can share information, you can even be vulnerable and express your own lived experience. But if people don't want to listen, they're not going to listen. And to Tony's point about the backfire effect, right? And the way that I would even, my language around that is just paradigm shifting. And we tend to reject when our paradigms are being messed with, we tend to reject that. And so I think you'll just find that sometimes you can plant a seed, sometimes you can water the seed, and then sometimes you just gotta let people mature at their own pace or get to a place where they're receptive of that. We have no control over that. So I just tend to, I really try to engage with folks that want to get this, that show an inclination toward it. And hopefully the folks that don't, at some point they'll get on board and they'll want to have an understanding. But I can't force that. So that's my approach.
Appreciate that. And just to highlight again before our other two panelists respond, question is sandwiched together with how do I deal with maybe not knowing the right way to go, or if I make a mistake or having fear of making a mistake in the process. And then also, as Philip was answering, those who are opposed to having these conversations because they think it's detrimental, how do we engage them or respond to that?
Nishika and I are looking at each other. Do you want to go first?
Sure. So I keep thinking about fear and just how fear can be this scary, debilitating thing. And I think that sometimes we forget that fear can actually be a tool, and it's actually really important. So I think that it's important to embrace that fear, to sit with it and be okay with it. Yeah, sometimes, and the reality is sometimes we're going to get it wrong. And especially when we're learning something new, especially when it comes to DE&I, this is heavy stuff. It's deep stuff. And I think that, if you're feeling that fear around it, you need to just kind of sit with that and be okay with it. Know that sometimes you will trip up. And I think that, as my colleague just said, really taking stock of what the harm, or what harm was caused, what level of harm, that really should correlate with how you respond when you get something wrong, when you get something wrong. So I think as far as the second question, let's see, second question was,
how do you engage someone who feels that this work isn't necessary or it's a waste of time?
Okay, so I definitely agree with what was previously said. I think I tend to focus more on people who want to do the work, but there is that part of me that also wants to kind of just bring people in, especially those who are maybe a little bit resistant. And I think what I've heard from other people is that diversity can kind of be the answer. It's like, okay, well, you have this diverse perspective. You think that this stuff isn't necessary. So we want you here. We want you to be part of that conversation. And so sometimes those people do come along. If you bring them along, they will, but some won't. And I think you just have to let those people be. I think the risk in kind of spending too much time and energy on those who are very resistant is causing delay with your overall goals, but also potentially causing harm to those who really want to do the work.
Okay, I'll go ahead and hop in on these questions as well. And I'm jotting my notes down so I can try to track. So don't mind as I'm looking at my second screen over here. But as far as that first question about this fear of making mistakes, I'm going to drop a little resource here in the chat here that you can literally just Google search this, Tema Okun on white supremacy culture. And it's not white supremacy in terms of like clans people. It's not that obvious, but just really subtle ways that certain cultural norms can show up, especially in the workplace, that often are not even known or even noticed, but they just create so many obstacles and barriers to forwarding this work. And I want to say maybe one of the first things that Tema Okun refers to is this notion of perfectionism. It's this idea that if I can't get everything perfectly right, then I don't even want to get in there. I don't even want to take a step. And that is a cultural norm that just totally blocks our ability to make actual institutional change. And what I love about this resource from Tema Okun is that there are also antidotes that are introduced to all these different ways in which these cultural norms can create obstacles. For me, in terms of this idea, I usually just, even in myself, when there are spaces where I feel like I need to be courageous for the sake of justice, whether it be racial justice or any of these other areas that needed justice, I just will logically take myself through the situation and even ask myself, what is the worst thing that could happen if I kind of screw this up? In the vast majority of situations, especially if I am wanting to enter into a conversation where maybe I have more privilege and then another group has less privilege on whatever the identity conversation is, usually the worst case scenario is that maybe I'll be embarrassed, which honestly is not that bad of a thing in my opinion. Usually those embarrassing moments, in fact, for me, have been some of my greatest learning situations in my life, because I will remember that moment and I will not forget it and I will not repeat that thing. And then also, developing this process where we seek to repair if we do cause harm, because it's inevitable. If your mentality is I have to have everything lined up before I'm even going to step off of the starting block, I hate to tell you, then you're never going to get off the starting block. So there's a certain amount of courage that we need where we just have to hop in there and just do our best to learn. So we're not just sort of throwing wild things at the wall. But then once we learn, we have to find places to start to put that into action. Again, just with the expectation that there's going to be a learning process and that none of this is a linear process anyway, because we're dealing with issues that impact humans. And so there is no linear path to be able to get you, follow steps 1 through 10, and then you get this product. It just doesn't work that way. So that would be my encouragement, is to recognize that, yep, you're probably going to screw it up sometimes. I screw it up sometimes, and I've been doing this work for many, 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 many years. And that's just kind of part of the journey, is us building up stamina to be okay with not being perfect. And then on the other side of that question, in terms of engaging people who think this is a waste of time, definitely I echo everything that both Philip and Nishika said. I guess one angle that I would throw into the mix is this idea of being strategic. So when you are looking to change this person's mind, what is your objective? What is your goal? Who are you centering basically in this particular process? And I think it's really, really important that when we're talking about issues of racial justice and racial equity, that we figure out what does it look like to center things that benefits Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I remember seeing on social media, it might have been, maybe it's Ijoma Oluo, if any of you are familiar with her work. It might have been her, but it was someone that was saying that, frankly, we don't, and I forgive me if this sounds a little crass, but frankly, we don't really care so much about, that you have converted your racist uncle so they're less racist. Because at the end of the day, that does not transform these systems that cause so much harm to Black and brown people. So we need to be strategic. What are the actions that we can take? Who are the people that we can speak to and influence that actually can cause and move forth institutional and systemic change? And sometimes some of our relationships might feel a little yucky when people have these just terrible or harmful opinions. But again, we have to be strategic. Is it worth my time and my effort to try to change this person's mind when, again, human psychology tells us it is very difficult to change people's minds? So we have to ask ourselves, in any situation where we're trying to have these discussions, this is one of my favorite phrases, but is the juice worth the squeeze? And sometimes it is not. And we have to be okay to say, you know what, this is not really going anywhere. I don't feel like actually, even if this were to go somewhere, that this would ultimately benefit Black and brown people who need the benefit because of racism and systems. So let me allocate my energy elsewhere.
That's awesome. You guys did a great job handling the double question there, so I appreciate that. There are some other questions that I believe are rolling in. I want to implore all of those of you who are with us today to please feel free to throw questions in the comments section. I think this group is more than willing to engage those questions and answer them. Keeping that in mind, and some of the conversation you all have given, I think a little bit about my experience and background coming from DC to rural Nebraska initially, and being in a small town of 500 people to do economic development work at one time, going into a VFW where I was the only African-American person in there. The rest of the folks in there were 50 to 80 in age, and all men. And I was invited by this gentleman by the name of Russ, who was a cattle feeder. and I dress just like I am right now. They send me to the front of the room and it's just dead silence. And I'm thinking to myself, this is what it takes to change minds. And I don't know why I went there, but I thought, how many of us who are from a different background or perspective would put themselves in a room with people who are from a totally different realm than you are? And is that where change actually happens? Those of us who are willing to do that, what do you do when you stand in front of a room? And what I said was, I know what you all are thinking. And everyone kind of looked like, uh-oh. And I said, yes, Russ is my father. I'm his illegitimate son. And they all died laughing. Russ's face was beet red. And this is an old cattle feeder with overalls on and a cap. And I think they just had a great time after that. It broke the ice of the conversation. But I think when you all talk about fear, I think a lot of the individuals, when we talk about our white friends or anyone from any background, I think I love the fact that individuals are willing to be courageous enough to put themselves in that space where maybe you're unfamiliar and you're the outsider and you have to learn about that culture. So moving forward from that, there was a question from Karen, differentiating two things. And so I'm hopeful that you all can help us here. We'll start with Philip and then go to Nishika, and then actually we'll go with Tony first since you were last on the last one. And then Nishika, you'll back clean up here. How do you differentiate between white privilege and white supremacy?
Yeah, I think I'm still kind of forming my thoughts around that. I guess the initial, what initially comes to mind for me is, I think white privilege is just something that you get because you're white, right? It's the treatment that you get, it's the benefit of the doubt that you receive because you're white. Whether you embrace that or not, take advantage of that or not, it's still something that is ascribed to you because of the color of your skin. To me, that's white privilege. And there's other, of course, dimensions and layers to that, but I think that at its most basic level, that's what that is. I think white supremacy is, I think white privilege is absolutely part of white supremacy, but I think white supremacy is the active mindset that because I'm white, I'm superior to you, I'm better than you. And we see that on the systemic level, in things such as, pay equity and health, and the way that other lives are treated that are not white, right? And it's that active force, that active push to really subjugate other people that are not white, And so to me, that is probably the basic definition or way that white supremacy shows up. And I'd love to open that up to my other colleagues, because I know that you all can probably take that a little deeper. So, yeah.
Sure, I'll add on to that. Literally, as I was processing this and writing my own notes down, Philip, I basically wrote almost the same thing that you were saying in terms of white privilege, that I believe that white supremacy is a big, giant umbrella. And I think there's a lot of different ways that white supremacy manifests. And I would say white privilege is one of the ways that white supremacy manifests in society. And so white privilege, yeah, basically all the different ways that whiteness and white people are more or less seen as kind of the default. And sort of everything in society that, is maybe labeled as American or labeled as normal or labeled as default, typically is intended to be for the benefit of white people. And there's another resource share that I'll see if I can type and talk at the same time. This article is, I feel like, nearly legendary at this point of time in terms of this topic. There's more to the title, but if you Google Peggy McIntosh white privilege, she has like this tremendous just list of examples, just really practical, tangible examples of white privilege. One of them, for example, is I can go to the store to buy Band-Aids and be confident that they'll be in my skin tone. It might be that I can share an opinion in front of a group of people and not have to take on the pressure of representing my race. There's just a whole list of just examples of the ways that that plays out that I think is really good for people to familiarize themselves with and just kind of get that general idea of what that looks like. White supremacy, I actually would say is a little bit broader than what my brother was just talking about. I don't think white supremacy requires, I don't think it requires that people actively and knowingly hold negative opinions about people who are not white. I would say that white supremacy is all, again, sort of that larger umbrella of all the different ways that whiteness benefits in society. And I would say it's a very, I'd say, close neighbor of the idea of institutional racism, in my opinion. So all the different ways where in society, and nearly every calculatable, or whatever the word is, metric that you can think of human thriving, white people are at the top of that. And so you can look in terms of COVID-19 and how different groups of people are faring based off race. You can look in terms of wealth, home ownership, who are the corporate CEOs in the United States and around the world, who are the politicians and the people in government in control and power, who are the people that are controlling power and allocation and access to resources, who receives those things and who is blocked from getting those things. And another, I love to share resources. I'm going to type another one into the chat that I love, and have shown to groups of people dozens of times by now. But this very short documentary called Segregated by Design does a tremendous job of just showing what that has looked like in history, and how it hasn't been just sort of this accidental and, oh, this people weren't really paying attention and this just sort of flowed and happened, but that there's a lot of intentionality in systems that were happening in the past that were so powerful and effective that even once these things are made illegal, the impacts still just ripple across time and across generations. And they lead to the disparities that we see today. And again, that's data and science and facts. And I think it's important for us to have conversations about white supremacy and racism from that acknowledgement of data and science and facts, because then it helps us to actually figure out, all right, this is real and true, so what do we do about it? As opposed to when the conversation is framed in terms of, oh, my opinion, your opinion. Well, no, it's really not a matter of opinion. It's literally data. You can look into this stuff and find it. And then it gives us that chance to figure out what do we do to unravel it, so that way everybody actually does have equal access to the same types of outcomes.
I don't really have too much to add to that after Tony. I feel like you just nailed it. The one thing that I would add is that I have stumbled into conversations where people are often very confused about the difference between a white supremacist and white supremacy. And I think, we all have it in our heads of, an image of what we think a white supremacist is. And when we think about that we might be a part of a system that upholds white supremacy, we say to ourselves, often, my white friends say to themselves, wait a minute, I'm not that. And they're still kind of seeing that image. They're like, I'm not that. So how am I upholding white supremacy, or how am I part of a system that upholds white supremacy? And I think it's really important to separate those two things. Someone who is part of an organized white supremacist group, someone who, fancies themselves to be a full-on white supremacist is different than what we're talking about here. That's definitely part of the problem, but we're talking about institutionalized racism. We're talking about white supremacy culture, and how very often you can be part of that and not really know or not really acknowledge it. And that really is the biggest problem. If we don't acknowledge these things, if we aren't aware of them, we can't unravel them. So, but yeah, everything, yes to everything that Tony said. So.
Thank you all. One of the articles that I've seen, or actually reports that I share internally with our staff, is the McKinsey study on equity for businesses. And so this question to you all is, how can our organizations and companies better integrate DEI into their company culture. So this is more of a very important question for our business community. How do we do that work better in our own atmosphere? So let's just have you guys chime in as you feel comfortable.
I can start. So, you know, I work for an agency, Community Transit, that is really at the beginning of our equity journey. As you said, and when you were introducing me, I just stepped into this position in March. And so we're really trying to do some foundational work. And I think that's important. I also think it's really important to learn from those around you that are more advanced in their own equity journey. I am very grateful to be able to reach out and connect with people like Tony or Kay at the City of Everett, and also my colleague over at Sound Transit. They have been doing the work for quite some time. And so they're able to share with me, what successes that they've had, but also they're able to share pitfalls and things that I should avoid. So I think it's really important to learn from those who are more advanced in their journey. And also, I think it's important to begin at the beginning. So avoid grand PR-driven gestures that may land as hollow if you really haven't done the foundational work behind the scenes. At Community Transit, we really have been going through this very intensive 6-session course on transformational leadership for equity. And so our executive leadership team went through this, and I think that was really important. I know that going forward, I have support for this program and everything that I need because my leadership is on the same level. And I think that that's an important step too. So yeah, those are the main things. I think that right now we're focused on normalizing diversity, equity, inclusion, and really celebrating diversity within our workforce and also the communities that we serve. And I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, I'll add to that because with we're Washington Employers for Racial Equity, this is what we're centering on is how do the 80 companies, the 80 CEOs, the presidents that have signed on to be a part of this coalition, how are they making their workplaces more inclusive for Black folks and all people of color in the state? And so there's a range of ways that they're looking at that and that we're trying to integrate equity to be really embedded in the culture, not just this thing that's bolted on or in addition to, but really framing the way that they look at this from a leadership perspective. Like this is just part of our culture. I'm reminded of James Thomas, the director at Alaska Airlines, director of DEI at Alaska Airlines, who said, we don't want a DEI standard. We want an Alaska standard, where DEI is so embedded into what we do that there's no differentiation. And so what we're is concentrating on and the commitments that our employers have signed up for is to focus on creating that inclusive culture. Like that's like number one. What does that mean? What does that look like from your specific culture? What role will equity play? And then looking at some very specific things like increasing representation of Black folks and people of color at the executive level, at the board level, right? Looking at pay equity and doing pay audits to ensure that you see where the gaps are at and how you're closing those gaps. Increasing internship opportunities for Black students and students of color. And so there's a whole host of those things, but it's really being committed. And to Nashika's point is not doing these things when it's just in the media, when it's popular. I really believe that DEI has to become boring, right? It has to be those things that just happen in the organization on a regular basis, that it's something that you stick to, that you are committed to and continue to do when the spotlight isn't there. So I think that that's how you get to it. It's not just because it's the popular thing to do or it's in vogue now, but it's really making it part of the lifestyle of your culture and your organization, and that the CEO, the board, they are modeling that behavior and continuing to push that forward and advocate that for the organization.
Tony?
And I would, oh yeah, sorry. I would just say, I would add to that, because I would say that the successes that I've had at the Housing Authority are precisely because of what both Nishika and Philip have talked about, where that leadership really, even before my position was created, that leadership started with our board of directors. And then it was very, very easily picked up by my executive director, who also just has a lived experience and a passion for this work. So once my position was created and then I came in to be the director of DEI, I had so much support by the most influential people in the organization that it just made it so much smoother to move things through. And that is just something that really bums me out, that I see with a lot of my colleagues who are so passionate and knowledgeable and skilled at this work, but they do not have the support of the leadership. So they're just sort of banging their head against the wall, trying to get things to go through, but then no one is supporting the work and no one is helping to push the work through. I think that over communication is a big part of this process. And Nishika talked about normalizing. And that's a really powerful word. Another one of my, and this is, I'm maybe getting a little ahead of the gun, but I just want to share right here. Total game-changing resource for me actually came from GARE, that's the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And they have, I believe it's called their Theory of Change model that lays out this whole framework on how you work on operationalizing DEI into your organization. And starting with normalizing it into the culture is usually the first place that you want to start at. And I would say having some level of assessment as well, so you know what the status is of your organization. But on top of all that, I would say really it's about being strategic and having a plan. A lot of organizations desire for this stuff to go forward, but they just sort of do individual actions or individual initiatives that are not integrated into a larger, longer term game plan to change the culture of the organization, both in terms of that expectation, like I like how you put that, Philip, where you talk about it and it's integrated so much that it's almost boring, but people just, they know. And that's really important to shift culture, because if you just try to do one big event, then people will forget. They just will. So having that so integrated that it's just part of what's happening all the time. And then what's great is when you have I'd say the discipline to lay that foundation for your organization, it actually makes the process of beginning those more policy, process, procedure decisions so much easier to roll out, because your organization theoretically has received that foundation for why you're doing what you're doing, why it fits into the culture and the mission, I should say, why it fits into the mission of the organization. And then also it's just established that this is part of what we do. If you're going to be a part of this organization, then racial equity is just part of what we do. And for people to get to a place where they realize that and they can decide for themselves if they are at least open to that mission, and then hopefully they're actually fired up about it, or if there's someone that would potentially sandbag that mission, that they will realize that ahead of time and then be able to shift themselves accordingly, so that way that doesn't become another obstacle for the work. But having that discipline to lay down that foundation and then starting to get into some of those operations, and while also building relationships in the community with the peers and all that sort of stuff that are in that change model. I won't get too far down that rabbit hole, but really having an actual game plan and having dedicated leadership that is, again, dedicated to moving that work along and having a seat at the senior leadership table are all really, really important. And also one more thing I'll toss in there too is also budgets. My favorite quote about budgets is that a budget is a moral document. So you cannot say that you care about racial equity in your organization if you do not allocate appropriate amounts of money to it. So that's a really important thing to talk about and figure out as well, is are you actually funding and financing and paying for these things that both can live in leadership positions or FTEs or conferences or new initiatives or policy or whatever. But if you don't have money, it's going to be very difficult to actually authentically make transformation.
This is great. We're coming to a close on time, but you all have made this a very healthy and well-learned conversation. I just feel as though there's never enough time for these. And so with that in mind, I just have a comment, and then I'll ask that each of you provide us with some closing remarks on how our community can continue to grow in this space of equity and DEI work, but also any thoughts or ways in which you feel that your work specifically should be shined on currently. So my comment is that Economic Alliance, the Holmes County, we're starting to dive into that internal work to engage our staff on these things. But we also have a desire and a goal to do something external. And so I'm putting you three on the spot that we can reach out to you all for a collaboration in the future. So, okay, thumbs up for everyone. Okay, quick comment here, and then we'll go with Philip to close, then Nishika to close, and then to Tony to close. But you guys can all unmute if you're okay with that. I want to just get your rapid response to this quote from a very extraordinary American. I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. So go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important for us to always be critical. I would say productive criticism leads us to better outcomes and more equitable outcomes, and for us to always keep our eyes on what we can be doing to get better. There's always a lot of room for improvement. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you.
Yes. I think that I apply that everywhere I go, whatever group I'm in. So whether that's in the workplace or community boards, I reserve the right to criticize with the goal of making things better. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tony?
Is that, hold on, I'm gonna put myself on the spot here. Is that Baldwin?
Yes, it is.
Okay, yes.
James Baldwin.
Please read James Baldwin, everybody. Oh my gosh. So I love James Baldwin. And that's related to another of my favorite James Baldwin quotes, is if I love you, I must make you conscious of the things that you do not see. And that's the whole thing, is that so much of just my approach to entering into this is how can I reach you in your mind, but then how can I also reach you in your heart? And how can I connect these things to, these are humans and fellow people that we're talking about. And so if we become more in love with systems, or if we become even more in love with our perception or beliefs about America, more than the love that we should, I think, have for fellow humans and fellow people, that's a very kind of thin line that we just have to at least have awareness to. And I believe there's anything inside of our belief systems or thought patterns that creates some sort of distancing from fellow people and humans, and it detracts from our ability to hold empathy with people who have different experiences and perspectives than ourselves, then I think we're just setting ourselves up for a lot of personal pain and disconnect from people, and then also just a likelihood of inflicting that pain on other people as well. And so, yeah, I believe that speaking truth is so much more important than these ideas that we set up about sort of politeness or, not making people feel uncomfortable. Sort of like, if I have broccoli in my teeth, please tell me I have broccoli in my teeth, and don't have me walking down the street looking a fool. And I think that should be our mentality when it comes to these conversations too, is we want to know the truth so badly that we are willing to be uncomfortable or embarrassed from time to time if that is needed.
Thank you. Okay, so rapid fire closing remarks, 30 seconds for each of you to just give a brief statement. And while one is speaking, if the other can just put some more resource books that you're interested in and having folks read in the comments section. So Philip first, we'll go Nishika second, and then Tony to wrap up.
Yeah, so I feel like right now where we're at is we are planting the seeds that the next generations will enjoy around racial equity. And I think this benefits all of us. This isn't just for Black folks, BIPOC. All of us will benefit from this in some way, whether from a soul level, from a material level. So I think it's just important for us to realize that we're planting these seeds today, and we have to continue to water them to watch them grow so that future generations can enjoy it.
Thanks, Philip.
If you have the opportunity, mentor youth. That's like my number one thing. Mentor youth so that they can get involved in diversity, equity, inclusion young, and that they know their rights and responsibilities to this work. You know, I try to do that with youth in my community. And I would also say get involved where you can. I know that everybody is stretched. You only have so much time in your day, but whether that's getting involved with community boards or organizations, if you can lend your voice, you know, if you can be, you know, get that seat at the table to kind of move this work forward, do it.
And I would add that inner work and personal work and self-reflection, I think, is at the very heart of this work. A lot of times, and this is one of the things that I'll pick on us as Pacific Northwest people, but I see this a lot, especially in our region, that people, at least theoretically, are really passionate about these ideas of racial equity and racial justice, but don't take that step or that leap to sort of look ourselves in the mirror and figure out what are the things living within me that are complicit in these systems of inequity. What are these ways that I not only benefit, but, you know, maybe I actually enjoy the benefit, or maybe I sometimes actually actively do things that cause harm or cause erasure or cause invisible, you know, making people invisible or whatever the case is. And how can I recognize that these things are so buried deep within me that I have to always be vigilant, and I have to always be receptive to the ways in which that's going to be a lifetime journey. There is no process of, you know, hey, I did this stuff and now I have arrived and now I'm ready to go. Again, that's just not how it works. This stuff exists so deeply inside of our socialization that we have to always, it's almost like this is a weird example. I watch a lot of TV, but it's almost like a sleeper agent where there's these codes that live within us that we don't even know exist there until something triggers it. And then suddenly like, oh, I really did say that thing, or I really did act in that way. And it's the same type of stuff that I condemn, and the stuff that I'm not against. And to be willing to care for ourselves and be gentle and gracious towards ourselves, but then also honest as we continue to do all this, again, with the overarching goal that we really just want to see our fellow humans be able to live their best lives and have the same access to thriving that we want for ourselves and we want for our families and we want for our own communities. But once we recognize, and this is another, oh gosh, I'm gonna paraphrase this, I don't remember the exact quote, but there's a quote that's about, you know, recognizing that essentially that our neighbor's liberation like ought to be caught up in our own sense of liberation. And what does it look like for us when we actually see people that come from different backgrounds and experiences, where we recognize that their own liberation, that we also are liberated when we're working towards another person's liberation too. So I'd say, well, that needs to be a core foundation as we then go forth and do all these things in our spheres of influence.
I love it. Thank you, Philip, Tony, Nishika, for being amazing panelists with a wealth of knowledge for our business community and our investors from Economic Alliance in Snohomish County. We look forward to bringing you all back in some other capacity to have a deeper dive conversation on these things. And going forward, folks, we have the port report coming up July 13th, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. at Hotel Indigo. Again, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Be there or be square, and continue to do the great work in this space and reach out to our panelists because they have been doing this work for quite some time. And as you can see, they have a wealth of knowledge. So thank you all from Economic Alliance Snohomish County. Have an amazing day. Take care.